Let's dive right into today's explainer where we're tackling a really inspiring text about what it actually means to honor God. We're going to break down a core theological argument from the source material. And honestly, the best way to do that is by looking at three incredibly dramatic historical case studies. You'll see exactly how holding on to your character and faith, even when the circumstances are just impossibly dark, literally unlocks divine favor.
Here is our roadmap for this explainer. First up, we'll look at what actually matters to God. Then, we'll dive into Joseph's story of character over circumstances, followed by Daniel standing out in captivity and the Canaanite woman's unwavering faith. Finally, we'll wrap up with some practical takeaways for believers.
Section 1. What matters to God and prioritizing His reputation over personal advantage.
So to kick things off, the author makes this really compelling argument. Honoring God actually means putting His reputation first. Now, we are naturally wired to obsess over things like our daily bread, the necessities of life, our immediate personal concerns. But the text contrasts that with what God is focused on: His person, His work, and the coming restoration of His kingdom. The big takeaway here? The author points out that if we seek His kingdom first, God promises to providentially take care of all those everyday needs we worry so much about.
That brings us to the word righteousness. Now, that's a heavy word, right? But the crucial point here is that righteousness isn't just some abstract religious term to throw around. It's an active, everyday pursuit. It means literally aligning your actions with God's will. The source defines it perfectly as committing oneself to seeking the furtherance of His kingdom, honor, and reign. And the promise is that God will actually meet the needs of those who live this out.
Moving on to Section 2. Joseph. Character over circumstances and maintaining moral boundaries.
Okay, so let's track the insane trajectory of Joseph's life. It's a rapid descent into slavery, followed by a massive ascent to power. First, betrayed by his own brothers and sold into slavery in Egypt. Then, he's serving in Potiphar's house, only to face completely false accusations that land him in an unjust imprisonment. But finally, he rises to ultimate palace authority. Now notice this, while his external circumstances were constantly flipping upside down, and were often just incredibly cruel, his internal character absolutely never wavered. The author points out this amazing irony that by selling Joseph, his brothers actually kickstarted the very prophetic dreams they were trying to ruin. So how in the world did he survive that kind of pressure cooker?
Well, that takes us right into the heart of Potiphar's house. When Joseph was repeatedly pressured and seduced by Potiphar's wife, he drew a hard line in the sand, a strict moral boundary. He explicitly says, "How could I do such a great evil and sin against God?" He wouldn't even allow himself to be alone with her. He didn't just reject her to, save his job. He rejected her because his primary motivation was faith in God's plan. He guarded God's honor way above his own immediate comfort or safety.
And the author distills Joseph's victory down to this one highly impactful idea. Success in temptation depends way more on your character than on your circumstances. Think about it. Even when his solid character landed him in a royal dungeon, Joseph didn't sit around sulking or get bitter. His spirit was completely unconquerable. He just kept faithfully using the abilities God gave him, like interpreting the dreams of the king's cupbearer and baker while locked away in a cell. It goes to show that character, which rests entirely on committing to God's will, is what ultimately saves the day.
That steadfast character is exactly what eventually landed him a meeting with the king of Egypt. And even after years of rotting in prison, when he's finally standing right in front of Pharaoh with a golden opportunity to boast, maybe secure his own freedom, Joseph carefully guards God's honor instead. Pharaoh asks him to interpret a dream, and Joseph replies by giving God 100% of the credit for his interpretive gifts. For him, being absolutely truthful and guarding God's honor was vastly more important than trying to grab an easy personal advantage.
Let's look at Section 3. Daniel, standing out in captivity and resisting assimilation.
So while Joseph had to overcome deep personal betrayal, Daniel's story shifts the lens. It shows us how to survive intense hostile cultural pressure. In 605 BC, the Babylonian Empire had this incredibly aggressive strategy to basically erase Daniel's faith. They renamed him to honor pagan gods, they completely immersed him in Chaldean culture, and they pressured him to eat a rich royal diet. But Daniel? He gave faithful responses to every single tactic. He politely yet absolutely maintained his identity, relied entirely on God for wisdom, and courteously requested a totally different diet.
Because here's the thing. Instead of staging some massive, open rebellion, Daniel offered a positive, alternative course of action. He courteously asked for a 10-day test eating a diet of pulse. That's a rare Hebrew word that translates to things grown in the ground, basically vegetables, along with water.
And because Daniel acted on what he knew would please God first, God sovereignly moved the Babylonian overseer's heart to actually allow this test of fidelity.
And the results of that test are fascinating. The number 10 is the key to keep in mind here. After this 10-day trial, Daniel and his 3 friends actually looked healthier, visibly better nourished than all the young men who were stuffing themselves with the royal delicacies. But it doesn't stop there. Later on, when the king personally interviewed them, he found their wisdom and insight to be 10 times better than any magician or astrologer in his entire empire. No comparison.
Daniel is living proof that when believers make the hard choice to stay loyal to God's will, they aren't stamped out by a hostile society. Instead, they stand out. By refusing to defile himself, Daniel qualified for God's profound blessings, actually receiving supernatural abilities to understand visions and dreams. The author emphasizes a really profound point here. In these high-stakes contests of faith, our character is being forged and strengthened so we can face even more difficult situations down the road.
All right, Section 4, the Canaanite woman. Unwavering faith and a mother's desperate plea.
For our final case study, we are shifting forward into the New Testament to analyze a mother facing an absolutely horrific trial, and she had zero cultural or religious merit to rely on. Look at how beautifully her progression maps out. She laid it all on the line. First, she spoke honestly and directly to Jesus. Second, it was her desperate, compelling love for her demon-possessed daughter that drove her forward. Third, she honored Jesus completely publicly by calling him the Son of David, which showed incredible respect. Fourth, she persisted, even when Jesus was silent, even when his own disciples were begging him to send her away. And fifth, she submitted completely, pinning every ounce of her hope on even the absolute smallest blessing he might offer.
Which leads right into one of the most remarkable exchanges in the entire text. Jesus challenges her. He states that his primary mission was to the lost sheep of Israel, essentially saying, it isn't right to take the children's bread and throw it to the dogs. Now, instead of getting offended, she used this brilliant, incredibly humble logic. She replied, "Yes, Lord, but even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." She was basically arguing that just a mere crumb of his limitless grace would be more than enough to heal her daughter, without even violating his mission.
And Jesus was so moved by this incredibly public display of faith, hope, and love that he immediately healed her daughter, literally declaring her faith to be great. She proved that hoping in what only God can do means you will gladly accept even his smallest blessing. Think about it. She had no status, she was an absolute outsider, yet God's grace rewarded her true, unwavering faith. To really drive this point home, the author includes an excerpt from a poem by Randy Johnson titled Crumbs. It poetically emphasizes that God's terms are never ever meant to shun us. Listen to how beautifully it frames this. Those crumbs have the exact same power to enable healing and commendation, no matter your life station. It tells us that God's grace is limitless, it's free for all, and it is entirely fathomless to anyone who approaches him with genuine faith.
And finally, Section 5, takeaways for believers and principles for the spiritual journey.
So let's synthesize the theological implications from all 3 of these incredible stories into some really clear, actionable principles. From Joseph meticulously guarding God's honor in a pagan palace, to Daniel politely but firmly resisting cultural assimilation, to the Canaanite woman's raw, desperate persistence, the source material repeatedly proves these core truths. Always give God credit for your abilities. Never forget that your character will always outlast your temporary circumstances. When you faithfully endure, a heavy burden can actually transform into a bridge for your progress. Unwavering faith secures limitless grace. And ultimately, just as 1 Samuel 2:30 states in the text, God will honor those who honor him.
So I'm going to leave you with this final, really provocative thought from the author. How will you fill in the blank today? I want to honor God by... What exactly are you going to put in that blank? Just remember, whatever goes in there needs to be the things that matter to God, not just the things that matter to you. Because if you prioritize his kingdom and his righteousness, he promises to fill in the blanks for everything else you could ever need. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep seeking those things that truly matter.